and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg, as usual powered by Research Luxembourg and recording at the RTL City Studios. And our guest today is Giorgia Menta, postdoctoral researcher in economics at LISER, Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research. Giorgia obtained her master's degree in economics and social sciences from Bocconi University in Milan and her PhD from University of Luxembourg. She is an applied microeconomist with an interest in inequality research and the economics of education, gender, and health. Giorgia, thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so you have so many interests that I don't think we will manage to discuss all of them, right?
Yeah, my research has been very broad recently. So yeah, let's focus on the essentials.
Yes, the essentials. We will be not focusing a lot on inequality as such. I have to say that as well, because I want to lead our listeners to another episode that I recorded with Eugenio Peluso about inequality exactly. So this is the head of your department. So yes, definitely listen to him. It was a very interesting interview. But today we'll be talking about, yes, I was trying to actually think of how I could call it. And I would say genetics and economics.
Yes, or term we tend to use is social science genetics or genoeconomics. So the idea is simply the integration of genetic data into social science research to try and then understand something more about phenomena that usually we observe only from an observational viewpoint and not from a biological one.
And I have to say that this is very impressive. You would think, okay, as a researcher, you just have economics or you have genetics and that's it. But now you really have to be interdisciplinary, and these are really totally different fields. So how on earth did you end up this way? Sorry, I know that probably you have to answer this question all the time, just like me. Why are you doing a science podcast?
I get the question actually not as often as I would have thought too, but I do get this question sometimes. And I don't know, I started reading about genetics while I was doing my PhD, and my supervisor had a big role because she heard about some researcher working in this field, so she also fostered this interest of mine. It just started as a lot of learning and reading, because I had to go really back to my biology 101 textbooks from high school and read again what is the DNA, how is our body made, and so on and so forth. But it's something that I've always found very fascinating. I've always been interested in biology. I think if not an economist, I would have probably ended up in some other more hard sciences, if you want. So something perhaps life sciences. And just it was a lot of reading, a lot of trying to understand how can we fit this into the kind of research I normally do as an economist, the kind of research I was trained to do. And yeah, that's just how it happened. I had the time to do it because I was doing a PhD at the time. So I felt somewhat freer to pursue a lot of new things.
I would assume, maybe I'm wrong, correct me here, is that both economics and genetics are those fields that are just like, they are running a sprint. I have to constantly update myself, because with genetics especially, I mean, I have some knowledge from my school years, but when I was preparing for this interview, I was like, we are there already?
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
Is possible?
Things are changing so fast, and the cost of genotyping technology has been decreasing so rapidly in the last few years. There's a law in electronic devices and the development of new electronics. I'm not an expert, so people who are listening who are might forgive me, but it's the Moore's law, and the cost of genotyping technology has been decreasing much faster than what one would expect following this natural technological law of decreasing costs. And this has allowed the proliferation of a lot of different data and studies integrating genetic research into the kind of products they offer. So a lot of those longitudinal studies that we as economists use, or social scientists use in general, to explore different phenomena could offer at the time also biological data, so biological samples where people, I don't know, they just spit into a small tube and then the sample gets analyzed and their DNA is extracted. You know, the availability of such data has made everything incredibly easy for us to kind of delve into this new aspect, because we don't have to collect the data ourselves. That would be, I think, much, much more challenging. Yeah.
And this is a challenge, I'm sure, for many of your colleagues as well. Whoever I host here, there's the moment, okay, where do you get data? And the previous episode was about electronically assisted astronomy, and it was actually a researcher that is really collecting the astronomical images almost every night. So
wow,
it's a different story for sure. But yes. That's good.
We mostly use secondary data. That's how we tend to call them. So we don't necessarily interview people ourselves, but we rely on these large databases that exist that other governments or research institutes collect all over the world, and that link usually all sorts of socioeconomic variables with questions that are a bit more personal. Perhaps they refer to one's well-being and mental health, and also nowadays even biological information.
It's amazing. And I think this is the moment for me to ask you about two of the studies I noticed that you actually draw from a lot. Okay, I'm going to give the names. It's ALSPEC and UKHL.
ALSPEC and UKHLS. So these are two studies from the UK. And I have to say that I've been working on the UK so much, mostly because there's really a wealth of data that is easily accessible to researchers that is I found nowhere else, honestly. So there's really amazing practices when it comes to data sharing for researchers in the UK that makes it possible to actually work on these topics for researchers, even if we're not based in the UK. And ALSPEC stands for the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children. So it's a cohort study, means that we're observing a cohort of children that are born around the same time. This is early 90s. So people my generation, maybe that's also why I'm so interested in this data. It's a cohort of children that has been followed since before birth, actually, because it was pregnant women who were recruited to be part of this data set, and they're still followed today. So now they're in their 30s, they have children themselves, and so there's also the lives of the children who have been followed over time, and it's just such a richness of data of all kinds. There's really all sorts of things about the relationship between parents and child, really a lot of amazing data to explore. And the UKHLS is the UK Household Longitudinal Study. It's another of this study, and this is instead of being a cohort, it's a panel. So it's what you would call a representative panel of the UK, meaning that people all over the UK have been sampled to be part of this study. And if you look at phenomena in this particular study, you would be able to infer results for the general population. This is generalizable to the whole UK. And there as well, a few years ago, they've made available genetic information for a subsample of participants who agreed to be part of this newer data collection. So it's also very, very exciting.
But I'm also thinking that it means that if you participate in such a study, then you can always expect that people want more data from you.
That is potentially a cost of this, but they're always asked for consent for everything, and we're very careful about data protection. Accessing genetic data is not an easy feature in the sense that we really need to sign a lot of data protection agreements and be very careful about where we store this data and how we're able to access them. So there's a lot of attention to that, and people are informed about this, and they're informed also that their collaboration to these kind of studies will inform researchers and policymakers. So I think those that are already willing to participate in such an initiative to begin with have some sort of characteristics that might make them more, willing to collaborate in general. So perhaps even if questions add on, you don't tend to lose as many people as you would if you were just to interview people on the street.
But it also makes me think that you're only focusing on UK then. And if you want to know something about Luxembourg, do we have such studies here or not?
Well, yes and no, in the sense that there are some researchers, especially at the LIH and also the Luxembourg Center for System Biomedicine, that have been collecting genetic data and also epigenetic data. We can discuss this later if you're interested, but
of course,
they've been collecting this sort of data for years, but differently from the data that I'm using, for instance, from the UK, the sample sizes are smaller, and this in practice simply means that the statistical power to detect some meaningful correlations or causal effects is lower. So we cannot be as precise as we typically are in economics, because we're working with hundreds of thousands of observations usually. And these samples that I'm talking about that are collected in Luxembourg include barely a few hundred people, in the best case scenarios. And this is of course because it's been costly so far to collect this kind of data, and they're also, especially because if you are in life sciences, in biology, you tend to be interested in much more than the few little genetic things that I look at. So the cost also of collecting more information is exponentially larger. So I would say yes, there are some small data collection in Luxembourg, but I think there is scope to create a larger database that might include not only biological information, but also, maybe link it with the socioeconomic panel of Luxembourg, the cell that StatEc collects. So perhaps, there might be some scope to increase the availability of genetic data in Luxembourg.
Okay, so now we know where you get the data from. So we have to know what you do with it. And you said like, well, just a small fraction of that. So actually, what do you do with the data?
Yeah, so I do several things. I'd say that let's start with the basics. So how do I use genetic data in these samples? Why do I care about genetic data in this sample? Well, I use genetic data to compute what are called polygenic risk scores or polygenic indices. Simply put, these are measures of the genetic risk that a person holds of becoming depressed or of becoming more educated, of becoming happier in their lifetime. And I'm able to compute this thanks to what we know from the literature on molecular biology that tells us in these huge samples of people looking at the correlations between genetic variants and a lot of different traits, these are the genetic variants, the places in our DNA that correlate with educational attainment, that correlate with depression, that correlate with this and that. So what I'm able to do, thanks to this knowledge, is bring it back to the data I'm using and compute this risk score to tell individuals in my sample how likely are they to become depressed, how likely are they to become more educated than others. So that's really what I use genetic data for. And then once I have this variable, this polygenic score, I can test directly at correlation. So if you're more genetically depressed, what happens to your children, for instance? Are they more likely to be also depressed? Will they have problems in school or things of the sort? Or also how people with different genetic predispositions to be more or less depressed, how do they react to the same environmental shocks that we're all exposed to? So if there's a policy reform or just an exogenous shock happening in your life, is your genetic endowment partially responsible for how you react to that shock? Will people that are already more vulnerable to begin with because their genetic predispositions to be, let's say, more depressed are higher, will they also respond more severely to shocks? Or instead, are they more resilient and will they respond less? So that's part of the questions that I'm trying to answer with my research agenda.
Okay, that's a big question, right? And it also makes me think that if things go badly, I just say, yeah, it's my genetics. Sorry, nothing else.
So that's a nice thing actually about genes. They are very good average predictors. So they correlate very well in large samples with what they need to correlate with. So the polygenic score for depression correlates very well with depression in large samples, but they're terrible individual predictors. So they're not fortune tellers in a way. If I were to observe your DNA today and, I would compute your polygenic score for depression, I would be in no way able to tell whether or not you're going to be depressed over your lifetime. Because even though they predict a relatively large share of the variance of experiencing depression, they do so for populations, but not single individuals. But this is also true for all sorts of socioeconomic variables that we're interested as economists, because we tend to look at how your income, your parents' education, or your own education is going to affect your future outcomes. But simply, and we know, of course, that parental education is important, your own education is important, but simply looking at the fact of whether or not your mom went to college is not going to tell me anything about whether you are going to go to college or not. It's going to tell me nothing about which wage you're going to have in the future. So, but we know that at the population level, these things are very predictive. If your mom went to college, there's a higher chance that you will go to college too.
Okay, so there goes all the individual look at, trying to make it more personal so we understand, okay, now if you tell me this, then that will happen, right? I know this is a disclaimer just in case someone wants you to predict the future.
No, unfortunately we can't. And this is, I think, we'll never get to the point of precise individual predictions with what we call complex traits or polygenic traits, which are not, let's say, the risk of Alzheimer's disease, which is something very biologically driven or that has very specific, there's genes that have specific biological functions that are involved in the risk and the onset of specific diseases. But with complex traits like educational attainment, depression, income, all these things that do correlate with our genes, but are so much determined by the environment, we will never be able to really simply predict someone's outcome based on their genes alone. Because this person is born and lives in an environment, and this environment is going to matter a lot.
And it also makes me think that not only we're born with certain genes, but they can change, can't they?
Well, so the DNA per se remains fixed over time, but there is something that can change and is affected by the environment, and this is our epigenome. So our epigenome is, simply put, is the series of chemical bonds and all the structure that is wrapping our DNA in our cells. And this structure, which can wrap our DNA a bit more tightly or a bit more loosely, is going to influence genetic expression, which simply means if some genes are turned on or turned off. So it's a switcher, if you want. Epigenetics is a switcher, so it can...
Like squeezer.
Exactly,
basically.
yes. So sometimes, actually, something that I was really fascinated about is how much of genetics is linked to physics at the same time, because it's really a matter of if a gene is squeezed, then it will not be able to express itself because it's too compressed. If it's loose, then it's going to be able to express itself. So it's really also linked to simply the position in space that your DNA takes in their cells. And these epigenetic chemical bonds can be influenced by the environment. So it's been shown by research on animal subjects, but also on humans more recently, that environmental shocks, especially stressful events, can and do have an impact on epigenetic markers in a way that influences and changes your gene expression. So there's a new literature on the biological clocks, which are biomarkers of aging based on your epigenetics. So based on all these modifications that your DNA experience over your lifetime, based on these clocks, we can tell whether or not your body is aging at a faster speed or at a slower speed as compared to your chronological age. So are you actually biologically older than your age, or are you younger than your age? And this is partly influenced by all these events that happened to you that changed your epigenetics.
Okay, so not only if I do sports or not.
But sports is important. There are some studies recently that show that a healthy diet and active lifestyle can improve some of these epigenetic changes. Because the nice thing, I think at least, is that once an epigenetic change occurs, it is reversible. So they're not forever. Like scarring is not forever in a way. So it's just not in the negative, but also in the positive. Adopting healthy lifestyles and healthy habits can have a positive impact on your epigenome and make you, biologically younger than you are chronologically.
Whoa, I was just thinking, when you wake up in the morning, I've talked to a lot of scientists and they say like, and then I do a bit of literature review. And in your case, it's like, do you go economics first or genetics first?
I really have to say, I use Twitter a lot to help me stay in touch with academics and people like doing research. And I try to go to as many conferences in my field as I can. So, can see people presenting what they're recently working on and try to, okay, this is where the field is right now and what I need to do. But it's a bit of a struggle to try and keep up with all the developments because there are so many different fields and there's only so much you can achieve in a day. Yeah, so it is a bit of a challenge.
And not only so much you can achieve in a day, but then there is also what you get from your parents. And that's what I wanted to move on to. So one of the research that you focused on is mental health of mothers and how it influences the children, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
This idea started, I've been working during my PhD thesis on what are the determinants of child human capital. And by child human capital, I mean...
Yes, exactly, please.
Yes.
To normal beings,
it's a term that we
please.
use in economics as if it was, normal peanut butter. But, it's actually, of course, for those who are not in the field, it's not necessarily the most common term. And we interpret it as the combination of skills that contribute to the successful life of individuals. And these skills can be cognitive ones, such as intelligence, educational achievement, but they also can be non-cognitive ones. And here we can think of all soft skills, interpersonal skills, memory, all the things that make us, more likely to be successful, whatever success means. So the combination of cognitive and non-cognitive skills is known in economics as human capital. So we wanted to understand, and there's a large literature trying to investigate what are the determinants of the emergence of human capital in children. So how does human capital accumulate over time? Are parental investments more important at some specific points in time, like when the child is very young, or are they more important later on in life? So this is part of this very fascinating literature. And what we've been thinking about is what happens if one of your parents is struggling with mental health? How, as a child, are you going to cope with this? How is it going to affect your outcome if there's any causal mechanism? And it's very difficult to look at the causal effect of parental depression on children outcomes, because we cannot simply randomize the depression and assign it randomly to some people. So, of course, if the onset of depression correlates with a lot of other variables, a lot of other situations and environments that make it very hard to disentangle a correlation from a causal link. So what we thought of doing is, why don't we try to bring genes in the picture? And there's something nice about genes, that is, we don't choose them, in the sense that our own DNA is a completely random draw from our parents' DNA. So if, let's say, all of our parents met at random and decided to have children at random, then all of our DNA would be the result of a random draw. Of course, it's not that simple, because our parents choose each other based on some characteristics. They also live closer to each other in some specific geographical clusters. So things are a bit more hard than it looks. But the idea is that you can take genes as something sort of given, sort of exogenous, that does not really depend on other factors as much, at least, as the observing depression does. So what we started doing was simply look at the correlation between mother's genetic predisposition to be depressed and children's school outcomes and mental health and well-being. So these non-cognitive skills that are part of child human capital. And what we found is that there's a negative association between maternal predisposition to be more depressed and child human capital. And this negative association is stronger for non-cognitive rather than cognitive skills. So children's interpersonal skills and their socio-emotional well-being suffers more from having a mother with a higher risk of having depression as compared to someone whose mother has a lower risk of having depression. And of course, you might say this is quite obvious. The majority of this effect is mediated. The main channel that drives this effect is maternal depression itself. Of course, if you have a higher genetic predisposition to be depressed, then it's going to feed into your actual depression. And this is really what's going to matter in terms of your child outcomes. But part of this association also flows through other channels, such as genetic inheritance. Your child is inheriting part of your genes. So that contributes a little bit to the correlation. There's also other forms of family environment that are influenced by mother's genes. They are not depression itself, but their nurturing practices or the family environment in general might be influenced by these genes in a way that affects child human capital. So this is, let's say, what we observe, this negative association is a composite effect of not just maternal depression, but several things that can be influenced once you have higher genetic predisposition to be depressed.
Okay, better not to have children, but after all you told me, it's always, as I am a parent myself, I always wonder from a lay perspective, of course, how much we influence or we don't influence. So once you told me that, I don't know my genetic predisposition and you will not tell me, but still I do know that there are a lot of factors that do get influenced. So let's leave it there. But I wanted actually, it's a bit late to ask the pop quiz question, but still we're going to go for it. Well, so remember, listeners, we are asking always in our episodes a pop quiz question that is related somehow to the research that our guest does. And then we reveal the answer only at the end. So it's a little bit related to what we discussed, but not exactly. We're not talking just the whole child human capital, right? So can you please ask the question and remember, answer only at the end.
So a concept that we deal a lot with in social science genetics is the concept of heritability. And heritability simply means that the fraction of the variance of a given trait that is only due to genes. So the fraction of depression that is only due to genes, the fraction of education that is only due to genes. So practitioners can estimate this in different ways. I'm not going to be very precise on that, but just the question that I have for you is, what is the average heritability of a trait like educational attainment? So what is the portion of educational attainment that is only due to genes and nothing else?
Great, clear question, answer as usual, only at the end. And we move back to the mental health we were discussing and maternal depression, because I was curious. Mental health is, for me at least, a little bit of a buzzword nowadays, especially after COVID times. We discussed a lot the well-being and everything, and I'm sure you also get these questions a lot. Is it something that is really discussed in economics as such, or do you still have to convince your colleagues, let's do it, it's important?
That's a very good question. So it's been sometimes a struggle to convince other fellow economists that mental health is an important topic to look at. But I have the feeling that in the recent I don't know, 10, 15 years, things have been changing a little bit in economics as well, because there is a bulk of the profession that is very traditional, let's say, about the topics that are addressed, the way of doing economics, the kind of models that we need to use. But I feel the attention towards well-being and mental health has been increasing over time. So what I tend to do when I have an audience of people that are not necessarily into this strand of research as much as I am is try to point to the costs of mental ill health. So, for instance, since I work a lot on the UK, there's a report from the OECD in 2018 that states that the total cost of mental ill health in the UK are something close to 108 billion pounds. And this is a huge number, and it's about 1.5% of the GDP of the UK for that particular year. So it's sizable. And it's a, if there's one thing that convinces economists, usually is money, talking about money. So that's, with that argument, I feel like I have a bit more attention towards mental health, and how preventing it and treating it is an important part of what we might want to do as societies, because it's costly to have it.
Yes, now I understand why you call yourself an applied microeconomist, because we were talking about, cost, usefulness, how to explain it to people, right, in this particular case. Okay, so we leave this a little bit aside. I mean, in the sense that we're not looking at children anymore, but we're again looking at UK study and UK data. Another project of yours was more about something related to retirement age and depression. So what was it about, and what did you find out?
Yes, so we had something that I'm working a bit more recently is gene-environment interactions. And gene-environment interactions are part of what I was mentioning earlier about how our genetic predispositions can influence the way we react to our environments. And in particular, we were looking at the sort of falling out of the sky reform, something that people did not expect, that affected the life of individuals in a way that was not dependent on their own characteristics. And this was a pension reform in the UK that affected retirement age of women of certain ages and certain cohorts, so that retirement age would shift from 60 years of age to 65 years of age. And it only affected women because men were already at 65 years of age. So there's nothing, gender inequality going on there. Is simply a reform that was, trying to progressively increase the retirement age of women. And the way this reform worked was that retirement age was increasing by 1 month every 2 months. So this reform went on for 10 years. So it was a very long reform.
So you're saying, yes, a lot of data.
A lot of data, yes. And the nice thing about this is that we're able to compare basically two women who were born in the same year, who are exactly the same age. Just one is born one day, one month before or after the other, so that one of them will be affected by having 1 month longer to stay in the labor market, and the other one will be able to retire earlier. So is this sort of random difference that is falling upon these women generating any reaction? And in particular, we're wondering, is the fact that I have to stay longer in the labor market going to affect my mental health? And what we do find, and this is consistent with some other studies on similar things, is that women who have to stay longer on the labor market because of this reform, they suffer from mental health issues. And in particular, they are more likely to be diagnosed with depression. They not only report feeling a bit more unhappy and depressed, but they're also more likely to be diagnosed with depression, which is a bit more objective, if you want, or less open to discussion and simply saying, yes, I feel a bit down, I feel a bit unhappy. So what we thought was it's good to know, in the sense that we want to be able to understand what are the perverse effects of reforms while they're there, so that we can intervene on those perverse effects. But we're thinking, is this effect really going on for everyone in society, or are there women that are more affected by this? And in particular, are women that are more vulnerable in terms of genetics because their genetic predisposition to be more depressed is higher? Are these women the ones that are really suffering more from this reform, or are they the ones that are suffering less for some reasons? And what we find is that it seems to suggest that the reform only impacted the mental health of women whose genetic predisposition to be depressed was already higher than average. So the reform, in a way, exacerbated the mental health inequalities that are there simply because of the genetic lottery at birth, simply because of the fact that we have different genetic endowments. So it further pushed apart the mental health outcomes of women who were already more likely to suffer from mental health problems.
And that points to a need to some certain kind of policy aimed exactly at such people.
Exactly. And I think it's important to know which kind of unwanted effects some policies might have, so that if needed to put in place, they can come with an accompanying set of other measures that will cushion in a way the negative effects. So if it's known that this kind of staying longer in the labor market has negative effect on mental and physical health, because we also find some negative effect onto physical health, then maybe let's try to put in place a system that helps women who are affected by this reform, go through the disappointment of having to stay longer in the labor market, of delaying retirement plans, and let's try to prevent burnout or depression or the onset of mental health symptoms.
It's good that you don't have to now just give advice how to do it. You just pointed to, because I'm thinking that that's the difficult part too. Although it's better to actually be informed that these are the effects you can get. It's already that's small step, right?
I think it's a lot of times in economics we are the destructive part and a bit less the constructive part. No, but there's a lot of research that actually studies the effect of positive intervention. So I've been focusing on something negative, but there's a lot of interesting research looking at what is the effect of treating maternal depression, for instance, and the spillovers it has on members of the family in general, and what are the cost benefits of this sort of interventions.
And we're jumping again. Let me think. I think when the listeners will be listening to this episode, it's going to be a little bit before the housing day that is organized by the University of Luxembourg. And there we have something about housing and effects and discrimination, whatever else. So tell us a little bit. That was an online survey, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. So this is very different from what I've been talking about so far, because I'm also interested in inequality research. So with a few colleagues of mine, we started wondering, housing is such a hot topic in Luxembourg. We know there's a lot of problems, especially on the most vulnerable side of the market, which is typically buyers and renters. But we were thinking about the other side of the market. So what happens to sellers when they try to sell their houses on the market? Is there any evidence of some form of discrimination against sellers that come from specific countries as compared to locals? And this is something that it's really missing from the literature, because discrimination against sellers is something that could be very important in explaining the wealth gap that we observe between people of different races, of different ethnicities. So the vast majority of our wealth is tied to real estate. Then it might be very important if for the same house, a Black person is going to get a much lower price as compared to the price that a white person might get. And there's actually a very interesting news article that helped us, framing this research question a bit better, about a couple in the US that I think in early on in 2023, early on this year, they had an appraisal company evaluate the value of their home, and they felt that the price was not quite right. They felt somehow that they could have gotten a bit of a higher price. So they had a couple of friends that were white pose as the owners of the same house. So they got rid of the pictures, changed the pictures with the pictures of the white couple friends, and had another appraisal company evaluate the value of the house. The price of the new appraisal was $500,000 larger than the initial appraisal. So
one case study.
Yeah, case study, but it might be emblematic of a systematic discrimination that might be going on in the market. Then, of course, the Black couple sued the initial company and got a nice, huge settlement that might compensate for the loss. But it was still, something that got us thinking, can it really be that for the same exact house characteristics, someone of a different ethnicity is going to get a different price as compared to someone white or, one of the locals here? So that's what we try to do in this online study. We try to give respondents a sort of a thought experiment where we presented them with 4 fake real estate advertisements. They were not really any particular house. We made them up, but they were similar in terms of characteristics to what you find on Tom or one of these website that we used to look for houses in Luxembourg, and we asked them to give us a price for these houses. And the main things that was varying among these 4 houses was the location. So there were 2 in Luxembourg City, 1 in Esch-sur-Alzette, the other one in Echternach. So this was driving, let's say, the main price differential. But to half of the respondents in our sample at random, we gave one extra piece of information, which was the name of a private seller that was, the owner of the house. And, we had the locals, Mr. Schmidt and Mr. Clement, of course, coming from Luxembourg or the greater region area. Then we had Mr. Da Silva, which, Portuguese origin, the largest foreign share of migrants in Luxembourg comes from Portugal. So we wanted to have a representation from a large migrant group. And then we also wanted to have representation from a smaller migrant group that is becoming increasingly prevalent in Luxembourg, such as people from sub-Saharan African countries. So we had also Mr. Mutombo, which is a surname that is popular in some sub-Saharan African countries. And what we find in our data is that the price that individuals give to houses owned by Mr. Mutombo are 4% lower than the prices that they give to houses owned by all other names. And this is keeping constant the house characteristics, because due to the fact that it's an experiment online, we randomize the order of appearance of the advertisement, but also the combination of name and advertisement. So that, Mr. Mutombo sometimes will be appearing as the owner of the house in Luxembourg, another time of the owner of the house in Esch. So we can keep constant the characteristic of the house in a way that allows us to say that for the same exact house, for the same exact characteristics, Mutombo receives a 4% price penalty. And this translates into a penalty of 22,000 euros. It's quite large because, 4% of the price of a house in Luxembourg can get to 22,000 euros.
Yes. Okay, that doesn't make me feel very happy, to be honest.
No, me neither. And in a way, we were hoping somehow not to find anything, because Luxembourg, it's often described as a successful history of integration, as a country where, there's a lot of multiculturality, and you would expect somehow discrimination to be less salient in Luxembourg as compared to other countries, at least. But that is not the case, unfortunately. So I can imagine these figures might be even higher in neighboring countries, for instance. I don't know, in France or Germany, perhaps this is even would be even worse than what we find in Luxembourg.
Yes, definitely possible. Something to look into and maybe research even more for sure. And we will also share the link to the article you talked about in case someone wants to read something that sparked your idea, let's say. But yeah, now looking at the clock, I think this is the moment that we go back to the pub quiz question. So if you can remind our listeners what the question was about, and then please give us the answer.
So the question I asked was, what is the average heritability of educational attainment? And the answer to the question is, it depends.
Yes, my favorite scientific answer.
There's let's say I can give you a range for what is scientists define as a plausible number for this value. So from twin studies and adoption studies, we know that, comparing the outcomes of identical twins versus fraternal twins, we know that we can sort of account for the role of genetics, and the role of genetics into explaining educational attainment can be up to 40 or 50% of the total variation we observe in educational attainment. So your genes can account up to half of the total variation that you see in educational attainment. However, molecular genetic studies are not there yet, in the sense that to be able to actually detect this high correlation in real sample using real genetic data, you need huge amount of information, huge samples. And the latest study has a sample of roughly 3 million people. And this is still not enough to observe, to get to this 40% or 50% correlation. So what we have so far empirically is about 16%. So maybe the truth lies somewhere in between, but between 16% and 40% is still quite a large portion of the pie, if you ask me. So that's the portion of educational attainment that can be explained by our genetic endowment.
Okay, very interesting. And, I was just thinking whether that makes me want to make more effort or less effort. I don't know. But for sure, some effort is always welcome, right? Yes. Just like for this podcast today, it was really, really interesting. And thank you so much, Giorgia, for coming and sharing all the different sides of your research. And I think there will be definitely more coming. I still have a bit of a list of questions I wanted to ask. So I'm just waiting for your new publications so we can meet again and discuss them.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And this is it for today. Of course, don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, to rate us, to write to me if you have any suggestions for guests, any comments. We are present on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, or should I say X. Thank you so much for listening. This was Silax, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.